You know those iconic images of the American Revolution, the Minutemen at Concord Bridge? But have you ever stopped to think about um, what else was happening in those early tense days? What if I told you there was a surprising and significant naval element unfolding almost simultaneously with those first shots?
Hmm.
Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating, often overlooked series of events. The Battle of Chelsea Creek. You might also hear it called the Battle of Noddle's Island, or Hog Island. It all took place on May 27th and 28th, 1775.
That's right. And it's worth noting those different names, Chelsea Creek, Noddle's Island, Hog Island, they essentially referred to the same series of actions unfolding around these connected locations.
Exactly.
And we have some really compelling historical accounts that detail this early, crucial engagement during the Siege of Boston. To help visualize it, picture Chelsea Creek as a waterway separating the mainland town of Chelsea from Noddles and Hog Islands. Our historical map gives a pretty clear view of how these islands sat in relation to Boston back then. Keep that geography in mind, along with the symbols of the opposing sides. The British Union flag and red ensign, representing the crown, and the pine tree flag, a symbol of the, well, burgeoning colonial resistance in that area.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to uncover why this particular battle, the second military engagement of the Boston campaign, was actually so important. We want to understand its impact on those very early stages of the siege of Boston.
Definitely.
Because while we often think of the siege as, the colonial militia surrounding the land approaches to the city, this battle reveals a much more dynamic and, well, water-involved picture.
Absolutely. Following Lexington and Concord, the colonial militia did indeed converge on Boston, effectively cutting off land access for the British forces. However, it's vital to remember that the British still controlled Boston Harbor.
Okay.
This meant their lifeline for essential supplies from places like Nova Scotia and even Britain remained open, by sea.
Okay, so you're a colonial leader looking at this situation.
Yeah.
You've got the British bottled up on land, but they're still getting what they need by sea. That brings us to the core objective of the colonial forces in the events at Chelsea Creek, doesn't it? What were they specifically trying to accomplish there?
Well, the primary objective was resource denial. Simple as that, really.
Resource denial.
The Massachusetts Committee of Safety, under Joseph Warren's direction, ordered the removal of livestock and hay from the islands in Boston Harbor, specifically Noddle's Island, Hog Island, and Snake Island, and also the coastal areas of Chelsea. The goal was just to prevent these resources from falling into British hands and sustaining their forces during the siege.
So it was a strategic move to further squeeze the British supply lines wherever they could. And it sounds like this wasn't just a shot in the dark. There was some prior scouting of the area, right?
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that just days before this engagement, Warren himself, along with General Artemus Ward, he was the commander of the colonial forces surrounding Boston, they personally inspected Noddles and Hog Islands.
Really? Themselves?
Yes, and they discovered something quite remarkable. The islands were largely undefended by British troops, but were abundant in valuable resources. Livestock that local farmers had left behind when things got tense, and fields full of ripe hay. It was almost like an open invitation, really.
An unguarded larder for the taking. But this wasn't the first attempt by either side to secure resources in the harbor, was it? Tell us about what happened at Grape Island.
Yes, that's a crucial point. Just before Chelsea Creek, the British had actually launched a raid on Grape Island, which is further out in the harbor near Weymouth. Their target was also hay and livestock.
Same idea then.
Exactly. However, a significant and unexpected low tide hampered their efforts. It allowed the local militia to quickly mobilize and drive the British off before burning the hay and securing the livestock for themselves. So the colonists had already seen some success in this kind of, resource denial operation that likely emboldened them.
Interesting. So the British are now aware that the colonists are actively targeting these island resources. What steps did they take in response? And what intelligence did they have about potential colonial actions around Chelsea Creek? Given that the British had naval superiority, why do you think they left these islands so lightly defended, at least according to some accounts? Was this an oversight, or were they maybe focused on other priorities?
That's a very insightful question. Vice Admiral Samuel Graves, the commander of the British Navy, was certainly concerned about the security of his supplies. Beyond the immediate need for food, for his troops, he had actually leased storage space on Noddle's Island to safeguard critical naval supplies.
Oh, okay.
He feared their vulnerability within Boston, given the prevailing Patriot sentiments and the difficulty of replacing them from across the Atlantic. He had also received intelligence indicating that the colonists might attempt some action against the islands.
So he knew something might be up.
Right. Consequently, he had stationed guard boats, manned by Marines, near Noddle's Island as a deterrent. However, historical accounts do diverge a bit on whether any regular British troops or even a substantial number of Marines were permanently stationed on Noddle's Island to actively guard these stores and resources. This might suggest a degree of underestimation of the colonial threat, or perhaps a prioritization of manpower elsewhere. It's hard to say for sure.
Okay, so a bit of uncertainty in the historical record about the exact British defenses on the islands, but they were certainly aware of a potential risk. Now let's move to the main event. How did the Colonial expedition to Chelsea Creek actually get underway?
The operation was entrusted to Colonel John Stark's 1st New Hampshire Regiment. That was about 300 men. These were the troops the Massachusetts Committee of Safety referred to as being the regiment now at Medford. Under orders from General Ward, Stark initiated the movement just after midnight on May 27th. Their initial maneuver involved crossing the Mystic River. Their primary target at this stage was Hog Island, which, strategically, was accessible at low tide from the east by fording Belle Isle Creek.
Okay.
Remarkably, Stark's force managed this entire crossing without being detected by Vice Admiral Graves' guard boats patrolling the area.
That's some impressive stealth for a group of 300. So they successfully reach Hog Island under the cover of darkness. What was Colonel Stark's plan of action once they were ashore?
Stark employed a rather efficient two-pronged approach. He directed the majority of his men to begin rounding up the livestock on Hog Island, gathering hundreds of cattle, sheep, and horses.
Wow, hundreds.
Yeah. Simultaneously, he personally led a smaller detachment, maybe about 30 men, fording Crooked Creek to reach Noddle's Island. Once on Noddle's Island, Stark's smaller group dispersed into even smaller teams to maximize their efforts, proceeding to kill the remaining livestock and, crucially, setting fire to the numerous haystacks and barns held with hay.
And that smoke billowing up from Noddle's Island, that must have been the first clear indication to the British that something significant was happening. How did they react to this visual alarm?
Precisely. The smoke acted as a beacon. Vice Admiral Graves, aboard his flagship HMS Preston, spotted the smoke around 2 p.m. His response was immediate. He ordered the Marine guard boats to land a contingent of Marines on Noddle's Island.
Okay.
These Marines engaged the scattered colonial forces under Stark. Crucially, Graves also dispatched the armed schooner Diana, commanded by his nephew, Lieutenant Thomas Graves, to sail up Chelsea Creek.
His nephew, interesting.
Yes, the strategic intent here was twofold: to provide support to the landed Marines and, more importantly, to block any potential escape route for the colonists back to the mainland.
So now the situation escalates. We have a land skirmish unfolding on Noddle's Island, and a British naval vessel, the Diana, is moving into a key position in Chelsea Creek. Tell us about that initial encounter between the British Marines and Stark's men.
Well, the landed contingent of British Marines eventually grew to around 400 men. They organized themselves and began to push Stark's smaller and more dispersed force eastward across Noddle's Island. The colonists conducted a tactical retreat. However, once they reached the marshy terrain around Crooked Creek, they utilized the natural landscape to their advantage. They essentially took cover in the marshy ditches and then suddenly turned to confront their pursuers. From these concealed positions, they unleashed a surprisingly effective volley of fire on the advancing Marines, forcing the British to break off their pursuit and withdraw. One contemporary account vividly describes the colonists having squatted down in a ditch on the marsh and engaging in a hot fire until the regulars retreated. It really highlights their resourceful use of the environment.
You can almost picture the scene, these farmers and local militias, not professional soldiers in the traditional sense, using the natural landscape to their advantage in a surprisingly effective way.
Exactly. Guerrilla tactics, almost.
It sounds like the colonists were showing some real fighting spirit and tactical thinking.
Oh.
So the Marines are forced to retreat. What's happening with the Diana and the other British naval vessels in Chelsea Creek?
Well, the Diana and other smaller British vessels continued their movement northeastward up Chelsea Creek. They were still maintaining their pursuit of the retreating colonists and aiming to cut off any further movement of livestock.
Right.
By sunset, a significant portion of the livestock, hundreds of cattle, sheep, and horses, had been successfully driven from Hog Island to the safety of the mainland. Around this time, as the tide was likely shifting, Lieutenant Graves on the Diana attempted to maneuver his schooner to turn around, probably to avoid becoming grounded in the shallow waters of the upper creek.
Freaky waters.
Very. However, during this maneuver, the Diana ran aground. Lieutenant Graves, realizing his predicament, signaled for assistance.
Oh, dear.
Vice Admiral Graves responded by dispatching several barges filled with Marines and the sloop Britannia that was a tender to HMS Somerset and commanded by another of his nephews, Lieutenant John Graves.
Another nephew? Bit of nepotism, perhaps?
Perhaps. Their job was to attempt to tow the Diana free and provide additional firepower if needed. Now, while some older historical accounts suggest these vessels were dispatched simultaneously, more recent research indicates a sequence of events where the barges went first, followed by the Britannia when the Diana's situation got worse.
Okay, so the British are now in a race against time and tide to rescue their grounded schooner. But the colonists on the mainland aren't just passive observers, are they? This is where General Putnam and a significant wave of reinforcements enter the picture.
Yes. What's particularly fascinating here is that some of Stark's men, who had been busy securing the captured livestock further up the coast, actually witnessed the Diana's predicament in the creek. They immediately sent word for reinforcements.
Quick thinking.
General Israel Putnam swiftly responded, arriving on the mainland shore near the mouth of Chelsea Creek. That's a location in modern-day Chelsea near the McArdle Bridge leading to East Boston. He was accompanied by a substantial number of additional colonial troops. Estimates vary, but some suggest as many as 1,000 reinforcements joined the fray.
1,000. Wow.
And even Joseph Warren was briefly present and actively involved in directing the colonial efforts before returning to report to General Ward. Showing remarkable initiative and bravery, Putnam himself reportedly waded out into the harbor up to his waist to direct the colonial fire.
That's a display of real leadership. Leading from the front, literally in the water. So with Putnam and these reinforcements arriving just as the British are trying to tow the Diana, what happens next?
Well, as the British barges and the Britannia attempted to reach the stranded Diana, the American forces on shore, now significantly strengthened and crucially equipped with field pieces. And this engagement is believed to be the first documented use of field artillery by the colonists in the entire Revolutionary War.
The very first time. That's significant.
Very significant. They began to unleash a concentrated fire on the Diana. The Britannia and even British field pieces that had been hastily landed on Noddle's Island joined in the exchange of cannon fire. However, the volume and accuracy of the fire coming from the American side proved too intense. By approximately 10 p.m., the British rowers on the barges were forced to abandon their attempts to tow the Diana free and retreated under heavy fire.
So the British rescue attempt fails under this barrage of colonial fire. What ultimately becomes of the Diana, now stuck fast in Chelsea Creek.
With the rescue attempt thwarted, the Diana was at the mercy of the tide and drifted further aground, this time on the Mystic River side of the Chelsea coast. She ended up listing heavily to one side.
Not good.
Recognizing that the situation was now hopeless and, to prevent the schooner from falling completely into enemy hands intact, Lieutenant Graves ordered his remaining men to abandon ship and transfer to the relative safety of the Britannia. The Britannia, with the tide now potentially rising, was successfully towed into deeper water by Lieutenant John Graves.
And I can only imagine that the colonists weren't going to let a perfectly good, albeit grounded British schooner just sit there for the taking.
Absolutely not. As soon as the British abandoned the Diana, American forces quickly boarded the grounded vessel. They wasted no time in removing anything of value. This included cannons, rigging, sails, clothing, and even any money they could find on board.
Everything they could grab.
Pretty much. To ensure that the British could not return later to salvage or recapture the schooner, the colonists made the decision to set her ablaze. They piled hay under the stern of the Diana as kindling and ignited it around 3 a.m.
Went up quickly, I imagine.
I'd assume so. And it's a fascinating historical detail that the recovered cannons from the Diana likely played a significant role in bolstering the American artillery strength at the Battle of Bunker Hill just a few short weeks later.
Wow. That's a direct and significant link between this lesser-known battle and the much more famous one. So looking back, what was the overall impact and immediate aftermath of the Battle of Chelsea Creek?
Well, this engagement was a significant early victory for the colonial forces, no doubt about it. This naval capture, the very first of the war, provided a tremendous boost to colonial morale.
Huge boost.
It demonstrated in a tangible way that they could successfully challenge British naval power, even if on a smaller scale. The fact that the colonists suffered minimal casualties, just a few reported wounded, and no fatalities further amplified this sense of success.
Right.
In stark contrast, British casualty reports were quite varied and likely understated. General Gage reported only 2 men killed and a few wounded, while colonial rumors wildly exaggerated the numbers, claiming hundreds of British casualties.
Typical fog of war, I suppose.
Exactly. Regardless of the precise figures, this successful action played a role in the Continental Congress's unanimous approval of Israel Putnam's appointment as a general in the Continental Army, recognizing his leadership and bravery during the engagement.
Makes sense given his actions.
Absolutely. And beyond just the loss of a vessel, consider what the destruction of the Diana symbolized to both sides. For the colonists, it was tangible proof that they could challenge British naval power, even in a limited way. This would have been a significant psychological boost.
And for the British.
For the British, it likely sowed seeds of doubt about their complete control of the waterways and highlighted vulnerabilities they hadn't fully anticipated.
So, a major morale victory for the colonists and a potential wake-up call for the British. How did the British command react to this rather embarrassing loss of one of their armed schooners?
General Gage, perhaps attempting to downplay the strategic significance of the loss, ordered additional cannons to be mounted on Copp's Hill in Boston, likely to enhance their defensive firepower overlooking the harbor.
Trying to lock things down.
Right. Vice Admiral Graves, likely now acutely aware of the vulnerability of his ships in the shallow and complex waterways around Boston, redeployed the HMS Somerset to a more strategically advantageous and maneuverable position further east of Boston.
Learning their lesson, maybe.
Maybe. They also belatedly dispatched a detachment of regular British troops to secure Noddle's Island. However, by the time these troops arrived, the colonists had already thoroughly removed or destroyed everything of value on the island. It was a clear case of, too little, too late.
It's fascinating to picture the scene back then, with these distinct islands and waterways. Looking at our map from 1775, Chelsea Creek and Noddle's and Hog Islands are quite clearly defined. For our listeners trying to visualize this today, how has the landscape of that area changed in the centuries since this battle? This is where it gets really interesting.
Oh, the geography of the Boston area has undergone a dramatic transformation since 1775, largely due to extensive land reclamation projects in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Land reclamation, right, like much of Boston.
Exactly. Hog and Noddle's Islands are no longer distinct separate islands. The channels that once separated them from each other and from the mainland of Chelsea have been filled in. So if you were to visit the area today, the Orient Heights neighborhood of East Boston occupies the land that was once Hog Island and the adjacent Breeds Island.
Orient Heights.
And in fact, much of the rest of what we now know as East Boston sits on the reclaimed land that formerly constituted Noddle's Island. Even Chelsea Creek itself has been significantly altered. It's been narrowed, dredged, and straightened over time to better accommodate modern shipping traffic.
It is totally different now.
Totally different. If you look at a modern satellite image alongside the historical map, you can see just how these former islands are now seamlessly integrated into the mainland. The approximate former boundary between Hog and Noddle's Island would now run near where Constitution Beach is located, just northwest of Logan International Airport.
It's almost impossible to picture them as separate islands now when you look at a current map or satellite image. And what about the Diana itself? Given its historical significance as the first British naval vessel captured by the Americans, have there been any notable attempts to locate its wreck in Chelsea Creek?
Yes, there have been sporadic efforts over the years to locate the submerged remains of the Diana within Chelsea Creek. However, the creek has been subjected to extensive dredging and heavy industrial use over the past century.
Which makes it difficult, I imagine.
Exactly. It's significantly altered its underwater topography and likely disturbed or buried any potential wreck sites. In 2009, there was even a dedicated initiative funded by the National Park Service to try and pinpoint the Diana's final resting place using modern sonar and archaeological survey techniques.
Any luck?
Despite these efforts, no definitively confirmed wreck of the Diana has ever been discovered. It remains one of the enduring mysteries of this early naval engagement, lost beneath the waters and the vastly changed landscape.
So while the physical landscape has been reshaped by time and human activity, the Battle of Chelsea Creek, despite perhaps not holding the same prominent place in popular memory as some other early Revolutionary War battles, clearly had a profound and multifaceted impact. It served as a significant morale boost for the fledgling colonial cause. It successfully secured vital resources that would have otherwise benefited the British. and it even played a role in the selection of key military leadership in the Continental Army. It serves as a powerful reminder that the American Revolution was a far more complex and geographically diverse conflict than we sometimes imagine, with significant events unfolding in various forms and locations, each contributing in its own way to the overall trajectory of the war.
Exactly. Each of these seemingly smaller engagements built upon the others, contributing to the growing confidence and experience of the American forces. You can't discount them.
Okay, let's bring it all together one last time for you, our listener. The crucial takeaway from our deep dive into the Battle of Chelsea Creek is that the American colonists achieved a significant early victory